This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good morning, and I thank all of you for being here today. And we're here because we do believe in the resiliency of children and families. So the question is, what's the legal framework in which we're going to do this work? Over the past 20 years, much of our work is focused on collecting and using our data as well as understanding trauma and making changes to the legal system to reduce the trauma. The early work in human trafficking focused on decriminalizing victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, leading to massive changes in definitions of offenses and treatment of victims. But research from California stunned Congress and those of us in the field when it showed that children in foster care and children previously served in foster care made up 80% of the victims of child sexual exploitation. This research led to another wave of change for purposes of protection of our children, including safe harbor laws and prevention-focused legislation. Our panel will discuss the most recent legislative changes. You've heard from the Attorney General this morning about the Safe Harbor Bill Service Plan, referred to as Senate Bill 8, and as Rachel's Law, which raises the age for the statute of limitations in Georgia for victims of sex trafficking from 23 to 25. But it also creates a fund and a commission to oversee the payment of services for social, rehabilitative, and health services for our victims. Of course, we are awaiting the amendment for this to go forward, but nonetheless, this is an important piece of legislation. At the federal level, we'll be talking about Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which addresses the concerns raised by the California research. It requires child welfare to screen and identify children at risk, to provide appropriate services to those children who have experienced sex trafficking, to report missing children to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and to develop protocols for locating our children who are missing or have run away, and most importantly, to determine what have they experienced when they've been away from care. There will also be references to our Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was our first comprehensive federal law, authorized in the year 2000 and reauthorized 4 times since then, with the most recent being 2013. This is a 3-pronged approach: prevention, protection, prosecution. Another relevant piece of federal legislation is the Justice for Victims Trafficking Act of 2015, which improves response to human trafficking by changing criminal liability of buyers of commercial sex, creating a survivor-led U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, and giving directives for implementation of a national strategy to combat human trafficking. With collaborative work from the Division of Family and Children's Services, the Office of the Child Advocate, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, the Attorney General's Office, law enforcement, and our nonprofit partners, Georgia has developed a protocol and a plan to comply with these laws. Today, our panel will discuss the specifics of the legislation, how it applies to Georgia, and what implementation efforts are underway for the protocol designed to be in compliance with both state and federal law. In the interest of time, I'm not formally introducing our panelists, as many of you already know them, but I will encourage you to look at their online bios. They are our experts. Our first panelist is our child advocate, Ashley Wilcott, and she will discuss the requirements of Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act and the Justice for Victims Trafficking Act. Our next panelist is Beth Locker, and Beth has rejoined us in Georgia. We are fortunate to have her back, and her role is the division's federal grants manager. She'll discuss the requirements of the Safe Harbor Bill Service Plan for the division to address children in foster care and victims of trafficking. And then Jody Siegel, who's our deputy director of the Office of the Child Advocate, will address our protocol, what it does to address children in trafficking. So Ashley, tell us about the efforts made in Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act.
Yes, so first of all, thank you all for coming today, and I'm happy that my agency, Office of the Child Advocate, has been able to partner in this work and in today's event. Excellent information presented so far. We always learn more. President Obama did pass in September of 2014 the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, and there are a lot of different pieces of this legislation. So I'm going to touch on the highlights and then talk about how it applies to Georgia and what Georgia has done to implement. One of the things I want to point out, as you note in the agenda, this panel specifically about foster care children, and almost every one of the prior speakers today, or one of the members on the panel speaking prior to us today, mentioned that one of the most important things to know is that these are the vulnerable children, right? And those who target children for trafficking and for the sexual acts do specifically pick the more vulnerable children because they can then groom them. So this specific act addresses children in foster care to try to protect those children identified by the child welfare system because they are some of the most vulnerable children who are victims of these crimes. So let's talk about the numerous state requirements imposed by this particular act. First is this legislation was specifically drafted to identify and protect children and youth at risk of sex trafficking. And so it does that in a number of ways. One of the first requirements is that states are required, it's a must, they must develop policies and procedures to identify, document, screen, and determine appropriate services, again, I'm going to emphasize appropriate services for children under the child welfare agency's care and supervision, who are not only victims of sex trafficking, but are also at risk of being victims of sex trafficking. Now, this is a huge mandate. That's a very difficult thing for any agency, much less an agency like DFCS in the state of Georgia that's already has a lot of other issues on their plate to identify the potential victims as well as those who are victims. But that's what's mandated. Now, that was to take effect within 1 year of enactment. So by October of 2015, that should have occurred. So raise your hand if you're familiar at all, in whatever capacity you work, with policies and procedures in effect, effectively identifying all those who are victims and all those who are at risk. It's in progress. We've made a lot of strides. It's in a good place. We're going to hear about that from Beth Locker, but I'm just suggesting this is going to be ongoing work for probably a very long time. Number two, the state child welfare agencies, again, must immediately report children in their care identified as sex trafficking victims to law enforcement. Now, this is a good piece. I see a lot of practice at the local level in my role as oversight of this occurring, so that's good. And I think you're all familiar with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they're involved in that effort as well. Number three, the state agency, the Child Welfare Agency in Georgia, it's DFCS, must report the numbers of children in their care identified as sex victims to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And that's to happen within 3 years, so we're still within that 3-year period. Number four, and this is a really good progression to figure out how to affect nationwide this whole epidemic. So number four is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services must report those numbers to Congress and make it public information. That's to happen within 4 years of 2014. Next, that department must report to Congress not only the number of child victims, but also the number of children who have run away from foster care, include all the factors for why they're at risk and what happens to those children. Again, that's a lot of information, and the states are going to have to report well in order for the national organization to be able to gather that data well. That's within 2 years. That's a shorter time frame. Next, we've already talked about DFCS in the state of Georgia. DFCS has to report the missing youth to law enforcement and for entry into the National Crime Information Center. The last thing I want to mention, and it does other things, but the last thing I want to mention is that state agencies must develop and implement protocols to locate the children and develop screening to determine if a child is a sex trafficking victim and provide services. So there are those 3 prongs required of state child welfare agencies. Now, I just want to mention as an aside the things, and I recognize time is limited, but just be aware. Because the goal is to help these most vulnerable children, they have also incorporated other aspects of how to make these children less vulnerable into this particular federal legislation. So they've done that by saying, for instance, that APLA is no longer to be a permanency plan for children when they're 16. What is APLA? Another planned permanent living arrangement, right? They want to see that go away unless it's under very specific judicial findings and reasons. The second thing, normalcy for foster care. What does this mean? It's the reasonable and prudent parent standard. Why is this important? So that foster parents can be educated by the department to say, as a reasonable and prudent person, yes, it's okay for them to go spend the night with their friend. Yes, it's okay for them to do cheerleading after school as an extracurricular activity. Why? Because if they're not doing those things, they are going to be more vulnerable because they're going to like the attention of somebody who's coming up and saying, ooh, I'd love to treat you, and here's a letter that tells you all the wonderful things I think of you. So it's really important that it also addresses how to make these children less vulnerable at the front end. As judges, how does this affect judges? There are a couple points that I want to make. There's a very good resource for you, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Some of you may be members, some of you may not be. They have a lot of excellent resources around this specific federal legislation. But a couple of things judges should think about. First is, under this act, the Child Welfare Agency in your state, in Georgia DFCS, is required to work collaboratively with a number of different groups, stakeholders, and one of those is judges. So if you are seeing these issues, need more information, want to work collaboratively, and have not worked with the department, you need to reach out to your local DFCS or Beth Locker or state DFCS or me to find out who to go to and work with them collaboratively. The second is that the National Council that I just referenced is developing a technical assistance bulletin available to judges to help judges know how to identify these vulnerable youth. Whether you're in state court, superior court, probate court, they may still come in front of you while you're on the bench. So this is information that can help you identify them and what to do next. Then the last thing I would mention is that one of the things, youth engagement, that's a part of this act that I haven't yet mentioned is not only should the children be coming to court, but the court should be hearing from them and engaging them in the court. So I would submit that, again, regardless of what type of judge you are, in what state you are a judge, you need to hear from the children in court. You need to engage with those children. They should have an advocate for them, but you need to also engage with that child. Like the judge who spoke previously said, of course they're going to cuss you out. They're victims. They're not going to say, oh, thanks, Judge, for all your help. But it's important that you attempt to engage with them.
Thank you, Ashley. Beth, can you tell us, please, about the Safe Harbor Bill Service Plan in terms of what DFCS is doing to address our children in foster care and the issues around the danger for them in human trafficking?
Sure. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and actually, with all we had to cover in this panel, I'm really pleased by what I've already heard this morning that really ties into this. One of the things you have heard is that Georgia was actually a leader in addressing this issue for youth. As is also obvious from what you've already heard today, that doesn't mean we've solved this problem yet. We're nowhere near it. But there were a lot of people very early on, the organization that's now known as Georgia Cares and has been referenced several times. It started out of the Governor's Office for Children and Families. Judge Hickson, who was in Fulton County at the time, the Barton Center, all of these organizations were working on this issue a long time ago and really pushing forward to make sure we are addressing the needs of these youth. And so that has been very helpful. Historically, DFCS really only got involved when it was clearly the parent who was the alleged abuser. And that sometimes caused problems in these cases. We had to try to figure out if it was a failure to protect, or we simply just didn't see what was going on. And so now that the law has changed and DFCS is very clearly to help provide services to all of these youth, things have really changed, and we're working collaboratively. So, as Ashley said, some time ago in 2015, we were already required to have policy and protocol in place for identifying these youth, for providing them with services. And so one of the things, because there's obviously no way we can cover every last detail today, DFCS does have a protocol around the management of CSEC and DMST cases. And this was included with the materials for this conference, so every one of you who is registered has access to this with the conference materials, but it's also available online. And this is a really important document because it does walk through all of the things that DFCS is expected to do, and I'll go into a little more detail with that, and what we're supposed to do with our partners. So the one thing I will say, though, is, as we've talked about, the federal law, which also came before the safe harbor law, the Georgia law, that was moving DFCS forward too. So it's very hard to separate out purely safe harbor. We're working to address all of these. One thing, the safe harbor bill, you've heard a lot, it's going to be on the ballot in November, and depending on how the voters of Georgia decide, there could be additional resources to help provide services. But whether that amendment passes or not, there is a section of that bill that is already in law and that already mandates some actions by the division and by our partners to put in place this plan of services. And that plan must include, per the law, that we identify children who need services, that we provide assistance with application for federal and state benefits, compensation, and services, that there is coordination in the delivery of physical and mental health, housing, education, job training, child care, legal, and other services, that the plan includes preparing and disseminating educational and training materials to increase awareness of available services, developing and maintaining community-based services, providing assistance with family reunification or repatriation to country of origin for our non-citizens, and providing law enforcement officials assistance in identifying children in need of such services. So that is all already required, and we're working very closely. The Office of the Child Advocate has been fabulous in helping to call some meetings and bring all of the partners together to move forward on this. What we are doing, I said we're operating under our existing model protocol. It includes the risk factors, some of what you've already heard about today. It includes screening. When a call is made to DFCS centralized intake to report suspected child abuse or neglect, nearly every single case manager working in centralized intake has had explicit training on this issue. They have specific questions they are to ask, they know what to look for, and they know how to record this in our data system to make sure it's captured. They also are required, anytime DFCS gets a report of suspected commercial sexual exploitation of children, they must report it to law enforcement immediately. It's federal and state law. They report it to the Attorney General's office. They report it to Georgia Cares, our nonprofit partner providing services and case management and assessment to these youth, and they notify the PRO team, which is an internal division at DFCS, Placement Resource Operations, that really helps with high-end placement, since we know not all, but many of these youth really need an intensive setting to really wrap all the right services around them. So all of that happens, and that is all in the protocol. It also includes all levels of case handling, investigation, placement, permanency, and really moves it forward. Now, that's been in place. We need to do a lot more. So DFCS has been working internally and with external partners to develop all the next steps. And there really are 5 steps in our plan. It involves policy and program development. It involves data collection and reporting, education and training, and updating state law if needed, and then working in partnership and collaboration. And I think the 2 I want to hit on first, and then we'll get to the data, because I know I'm supposed to address that as well, but the education and training piece is enormous. We have to make everyone aware. So, for instance, I told you our centralized intake staff has been trained. And they've been trained, the numbers are reported to me, I know it's well into the mid-90s in terms of the percentage of those staff that have been trained. The ones who haven't been, it's for genuine circumstances such as they've been out on extended family and medical leave or something like that. So essentially, everyone taking calls at centralized intake has had this training. I recently had a conversation with somebody from the GBI who works on a lot of these cases. He told me several years ago, when law enforcement would pick up some of these youth and they would call DFCS to report and to access services, often these youth would need placement when law enforcement picked them up in a sting or in other settings, law enforcement would have to spend the first 10 to 15 minutes of the phone call simply explaining what CSEC was. And it was an enormous barrier, an enormous problem. He reports that problem is gone. They call, and overwhelmingly, when they are reporting these cases, the case managers taking the intake understand what is going on and know the steps to follow and are very helpful. So that's fabulous. That is one small piece of DFCS. And so now it is essential that everyone at DFCS be trained, close to 3,000 people. We've developed an extensive one-day training. We've started rolling it out. We've trained about 300 of those case managers. There's a long way to go, but there's a plan in place that they will all be trained no later than September of 2017. That's huge. All of our private providers, our private placements, the child caring institutions and the child placing agencies, there are trainings scheduled in January of 17. They will all get that training. We're working to roll it out beyond that. We're looking at how do we train our foster parents. How do we train all sorts of service providers? And the training, even though it is currently targeted at our DFCS case managers, any of you are welcome to attend. You let me know and you can come. We're happy to have people there. So that's just enormous. We have to recognize these kids and know what to do when we see them. So that's probably the most important starting point. Beyond that, the protocol, you all know, you hear 100 times over, those of you who work with juvenile court, the case managers are busy. They're very, very busy. And they cannot keep looking back through every page of this protocol. So, nor can they hop all through our current policy for DFCS workers. And so we are undergoing an effort to really codify the policy. That should be done by January, to put it all into a single section of policy, which should also really help with our case managers' response to the issues. And so that's huge. At the same time, part of that policy development was also program development. We've done a service gap analysis, essentially. You've already heard it mentioned, we have two fabulous partners, residential placements, Wellspring Living and the Victory Program at Georgia Baptist. Those are great, but they only service girls. They only provide, they have an age limit on them, 12 to 18. They cannot take youth who are pregnant or parenting. There's a variety of things that place limits on them. So they're wonderful for the youth who fit that program. We need more, even for those youth who fit their criteria. We also, several people have mentioned that there are boys who are victims. We don't have a residential program focused exclusively on boys who have been victims of commercial sexual exploitation, and that is a huge gap, so we're working to develop that. We know, and it's been mentioned a bit today, that LGBTQ youth are at higher risk for trafficking, so that is an enormous place. Beyond the placement, we know, we have some services. We know that with this population, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy is the standard. It works. We have providers in the state qualified to offer those services. We don't have enough, and so we have to work to develop that. So all of that is in place. I know I'm talking, so I will move on from there. Data, you want?
Yeah, if you go ahead and tell, what are our numbers around our foster care?
So I wish I had a quick, easy answer. Here's what we know. You've heard the number. We don't have good numbers. Nobody has good numbers. That is one of the primary reasons, that is the primary reason, that the federal law now mandates that states will figure out how to collect this data. We have some regional studies. Ashley mentioned some of the resources that have come out from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and if you look at some of those documents, some of the numbers they give, between 100,000 and 300,000 youth are at risk for CSEC annually in the United States. In addition, approximately 1.6 million children run away every year in the United States, and children who run away are at high risk of child sexual exploitation. Youth who've had contact with the child welfare system are at a higher risk for commercial sexual exploitation than children who have not had involvement. And studies have found, and I think somebody had the statistic up earlier too, that 70 to 90% of commercially sexually exploited youth have a prior history of child sexual abuse. There is clear overlap in the risk factors and the vulnerabilities, both for entering foster care and for becoming a victim of CSEC, family dysfunction, childhood trauma, childhood sexual abuse. These things result in a large percentage of youth who are victims of CSEC having also been in the foster care system. Georgia Cares, and I think it's their executive director who's on a panel this afternoon about services, so she might be able to talk more. But they survey their youth, and they know that last year alone, of the confirmed CSEC victims that they served, 89% of those victims had been involved with the child welfare system. 89%. It's a huge overlap. So we have to be looking in our juvenile courts when these kids come into the courts, we have to be watching for these risk factors and looking to identify them. So we need better data. Georgia is in process. Those of you who work in the juvenile court system know that SHINES is the case management and data collection system that we use. It's huge. It's slow to change, but right now it captures some information. There's a way to capture suspected victim of commercial sexual exploitation. There's also a maltreatment code for child exploitation. That's helpful. It's not enough, and so there are things in this process. We again think by January we should be able to capture confirmed victim of commercial sexual exploitation, and we also, so the feds require that. Our state law is now looking at labor trafficking as well. We expect the feds to go there, so we're also going to be able to capture a victim of labor trafficking. Those should be very helpful. Also in process, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council is leading the efforts, but there are a variety of us involved, and the Carl Vinson Institute of Government has been commissioned to do a study account, essentially, of child victims in Georgia, because we need these numbers. We need the numbers to access resources. We also need to know where they are in the state. This is a problem across the state, we believe. We know we've had cases, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but Georgia Cares can tell you how many counties their kids have come from, and it is the majority of counties. This is not purely an urban problem. So we are working on it. I would say, I was thinking about for juvenile court judges in particular, what is key? And a huge piece are these runaway youth. When there is a child in DFCS custody, so they are appearing before your court and they have run away, there are a couple of things. The law now requires, and DFCS policy requires, that child has to be reported immediately. I think the catchphrase is, and in no case more than 24 hours, but immediately to law enforcement and to the National Missing and Exploited Children Center. That is absolutely essential. They have tremendous resources for helping to recapture, to locate these children and bring them back into care. There also, as Ashley mentioned, are now provisions where DFCS must take steps to figure out what has happened to this child while they were missing from care. And so that's enormously important. And judges should be asking, if a child runs, has this child been reported? If this child has disappeared from anyways, has this child been reported to NCMEC, the National Center? And also should be finding out, where was this child? The case manager should be able to answer that question once they have come back into care. What has the child reported? Where were they staying? Somebody in one of the last panels mentioned, a huge red flag is, maybe it was Judge Levitt, if this child has been on their own for an extended period, how is that happening? How are the bills getting paid? How is there a roof over their head? Those are enormous red flags, and somebody needs to be asking questions. So judges should be making sure the case managers are, or the judges are asking those questions. Those are just enormously important. Probably the last thing I'll say, and then I hope there are some questions and we can answer more, is help us get the word out. So every DFCS case manager has to be trained. Go back to your courts. Work with your court stakeholders. Have you had this training? If not, tell them to contact Education and Training at DFCS and get signed up. Encourage your CASAs, your attorneys. Everybody needs this training so that they can identify, they can have the knowledge, and we can start providing the services.
Before we move to the protocol, I would like for you to be aware that there's federal proposed legislation to move us away from congregate care for our children. Part of the philosophy is that our children are more vulnerable when they're in group homes because they don't have the oversight that you have if you're in a more standard traditional family with parents providing tighter supervision than you may have in a group home. This would have a huge impact on our states, so we certainly are monitoring that federal legislation. But I do think you will continue to see resolutions. I could think you will continue to see efforts to restrict the use of group home settings so that children can be placed in settings that will be safer and less vulnerable to those who are grooming our children to enter the sex trade. Jody, can you tell us about the protocol, and can you tell us what it is that it does in terms of our children in trafficking here in Georgia?
Yes, thank you. So the statewide model protocol for the investigation and prosecution of child abuse and sexual exploitation addresses each discipline involved. And there are a lot of disciplines involved in this fight. We have DFCS, law enforcement, child advocacy centers, sexual assault centers, as well as schools, the courts, and the prosecution. So if we're not all working together, and if we're not all understanding that there has been policy changes with DFCS, or what other things that are going on that affect from other agencies that will affect our agency, we can be left in the dark, have very ineffective response, and therefore it really ends up hurting the child. So what we have in our statewide model protocol is basically everything that addresses not only the challenges that can be involved, as well as procedures to take. Every county or circuit in this state is required to have a child abuse protocol that addresses sexual exploitation as well under OCGA section 1915-2. What the statewide model protocol does, it provides your local level with a resource so they do not have to recreate the wheel. Our protocol basically covers all legislative updates, all best practices, and DFCS policy updates. So it includes everything that anybody would need to know. For example, this year alone, we have had a lot of legislative changes. One was under mandated reporting statute, the definition of child abuse now requires mandated reporting of children who are endangered. Other statutory changes you heard during Kamala's presentation that we've also changed some of the law regarding sexual servitude under trafficking, as it now includes developmental disabilities, as well as including even if the accused believed a child to be under 18 for undercover stings. We also added a lot of laws to the protocol itself. We now have new mandated protocol committee members, which include the child advocacy centers as well as sexual assault centers. So all of these new laws that cover a lot of things in the child abuse, child welfare protocols, all will be found in the statewide model protocol. It is different from your DFCS, CSEC, DMST case management protocol. Of course, DFCS's protocol has to focus on the DFCS response, the caseworker's response. The statewide model protocol, though, includes everybody. DFCS is not alone in their quest in terms of trying to not only combat, but to help any children who have been sexually exploited. So basically for our protocol, we go throughout the state helping train law enforcement, the schools, your mental health providers, everybody involved so they know how to be able to help and respond. Also, as Beth said, one of the things that DFCS also needs to do is train foster care workers. And as Ashley mentioned, the reasonable, prudent parent standard is going to be a little different for a sexually exploited child. Yes, you still want them to have good activity and still be able to get out there like a normal child, but they have to be trained. These children run. A foster parent's going to wake up one morning and say the kid is gone. They better understand that's a real reality. And when they're also trained, that reasonably prudent parent standard might have to change a little. Maybe one of the things that isn't reasonable or prudent for this particular population would be allowing them to spend nights out. That might be a real possibility. That's when they're going to run. A lot of things are different for CSEC victims really throughout the multidisciplinary response that the statewide model protocol addresses. For example, forensic interviews. It's very different for a sexually exploited child. As you also heard, they don't trust law enforcement, they don't trust DFACS, they don't trust anyone. So you may need time to build that trust before a forensic interviewer could even interview the child. There are a lot of differences when you're handling these type of cases that the public, that the multidisciplinary response teams, that judges, everybody needs to understand. One other thing I'll tell you is that hopefully with the things, your packet you've received, or even online that you can download it, the statewide model protocol is available for your use. We had a summit where we had over 100 attendees from every single discipline that helped actually revise this year's protocol. And I'd say it is 80 to 90% complete. We have a few more updates people want to provide by next week. So we're going to make sure we get everything everybody wants in there. But it's downloadable on the Office of Child Advocate website. We are also available to any of you that may want us to come out to either help train protocol committees, help train frontline responders, because they're so grateful to know what happens that the other disciplines do. Meaning, say the schools, they report. They know nothing what happens to that child afterwards. When they start learning and understanding, there's forensic interviews at a child advocacy center. There's a forensic medical. Where can that be done? Who's qualified to do those? There's so much that goes into these cases that I just wanted to share that with you. So we're always available as well to come to your respective counties or circuits and train. So thank you.
Ashley, where are we going from here in terms of the Office of Child Advocate, but also what will we see at the state level?
So I think all of us are aware that traditionally we have a lot of silos of work in child welfare, and specifically with any of these particular issues like sex trafficking. So I'm very pleased and proud that that is really changing in the state of Georgia and continues to move forward. We have, because of the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act and SB 8 that passed to implement that, and that requires agencies, CJCC and DFACS, OCA, law enforcement, I had to think about all the participants, to actually work together on the plan and look at the services plan to make sure that it's comprehensive. So I think we continue to see a real effort to work together to prevent the silos, and it's the only way that we're going to continue to make progress with trafficking and sex victims, specifically those in foster care or any children who are vulnerable in the state. One of the things that I would recommend and ask to move forward is, if you are having the conversation about these issues, continue that conversation. If you are not yet having that conversation, start that conversation, because we have got to continue to raise the bar, to educate, to discuss, to agree, to disagree, to really best serve these children. I think where we're going next is we've got a great foundation, a great base, a great department working on these issues. We've got to next be able to provide services for these children to try to prevent them from returning to that life that they've been victims of.
Beth, what about the department? Where is the department headed, and where are we going in terms of the division's leadership for the state of Georgia?
I honestly can echo a huge amount of what Ashley just said. The division has tremendous work to do on this. Director Cagle is extremely supportive of this work, but we can't do it alone. And so we feel very lucky. Ashley just mentioned the partners that are explicitly in statute that we have to work with, and I am grateful that beyond that, all sorts of other people have come to the table. There are other state agencies. I was just thinking, with all this training, you know, we actually are working with public health. They provide some training referred to as PREP. It's the Personal Responsibility Education Program. And they have this whole Making Proud Choices section that is provided to many of our youth in foster care, and it includes things on partner pressuring, refusal and negotiation skills. So that's another agency we're working with. We're working with all these nonprofits that are coming to the table to make sure we can fill the gaps that DFCS has identified and move forward, and that's what's essential. Data collection, training, service development, and not doing it in silos, working together. We do know there's still a lot of work to do, and I want to target things as much as possible as we roll it out. So if you're hearing of problems, please do let us know. I've heard from judges, and I appreciate it. I want to hear more.
Jetty, would you tell us where you see the protocol going and where you see the state going from here?
Well, where I see the protocol going is just keeps getting better in terms of helping local communities. I'll get phone calls from different protocol committees such as, well, recently I had one county call me, and their issue that they can't seem to square away has to do with between schools and law enforcement. You know, it's if a school recognizes something's happening, they want to be able to investigate it first or interview the children involved first. And that's really not how it's supposed to be done. So I get to work with these protocol committees to enlighten them on not only the law, but the reasons behind why the best practice is not, say, particularly that. So it's really getting different multi-agencies together that have issues and that can work through them. And like Beth said, you know, back in the day, DFCS wouldn't even respond to a sexually exploited child if it wasn't by the parents. Well, through other multidisciplines really reaching out to DFCS and saying, wait, you have to protect this child, they now can. So you see progress really being made when when everybody's working together.
And I certainly want to commend our people in the executive branch and also our federal partners, because the degree of collaboration and transparency that we have experienced over the past 10 years has really given us the opportunity to move forward dramatically in our work. And I want to recognize one of our important members here. Rachel, would you please stand up? Rachel Davidson is our liaison for the division. And if you need access to your local department, if you need information at the state level for your local department, she is the liaison for the courts, and she does a great job in that capacity. Ashley also talked to you about the resources of the National Council. The website is www.ncjfcj.org, and I certainly encourage you to look at the scholarships that are available on domestic violence training, on the human trafficking, but also we now have a training specific for judges for children who are the victims of sex trafficking. So I would encourage you to look at that training. I also want to emphasize the need for us to listen and make sure that victims have a voice. One of the basic tenets of resiliency is if a person feels they have been heard, they can heal. And I think that's critically important to the work that we're doing here today. You have been given cards because if we don't get to all of your questions today, we want to answer them. So please write down your questions on the cards, and we will get to as many of them as we can because we are standing between you and lunch. So we will be breaking for lunch, but if your question doesn't get answered, if you'll give us your email address, your question will be answered. Thank you.
And Melissa has those cards, but I'm happy to take them if you want, and if anyone would like those, and OCA can collect those and get responses from the appropriate individuals for you.
We're all standing between you and lunch. You've fed your brains all morning with information. Now it's time to refuel with actual food. Lunch will be served out in the atrium, which you've become familiar with, so please go grab your lunches. The instructions are for you to return here to the auditorium as quickly as you can, because of course we'll pick up again with some content this afternoon while you finish. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to, as we transition back, the opportunity to hear a spoken word presentation that I know you'll find inspirational and very impactful to this issue, to all of you and your roles in this work. So by that, please adjourn yourselves, grab some lunch, and we'll see you in a minute. I'm sorry. Please be back by 12:20. Thank you. And I'll make sure and distribute cards. Did you have any questions? We'll make time to get back to you.